Content warning: this video contains detailed descriptions of domestic violence, stalking, and scenes involving threatened physical harm to adults and children. If these topics are likely to be triggering for you, please take care. Skip, pause, or come back later. Christmas is supposed to be a night when the worst things go on hold. The lights go up, the lights blur everything a little, and for a few hours, most of us get to pretend the world is exactly as it should be. These are 4 stories that refuse that bargain. They remind you, sometimes painfully, that the season's ornaments and carols can become a stage for something far darker. The first one I want to tell you, the one that still wakes me up sometimes, is about a friend I'll call Jane. Her story begins, like a lot of bad stories, with a long, ordinary stretch of small compromises and slow violence. It ends, or rather spirals, into a single Christmas night that everyone at the party remembers in the way people remember being in a car when it skids on black ice, in detail, in the shock of how quickly everything tilted. Jane was 30 in 2008, working a job that paid the bills and left little room for glamour. She had an apartment with a thermostat she frequently cursed, and a laugh that could fill a kitchen. For months before the party, she was drained. Not the melodramatic drained, but the shattering kind. She would show up late to meetups, cancel at the last minute, and come in with a tiny, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. If you pressed, she'd deflect. If you pushed, she'd change the subject. Those were the first soft cracks. Her husband, Nick, was the kind of person who could still make tea at the right temperature and call you pet names even while he narrowed his jaw. People around them said he was intense and possessive, in the same breath they admitted they didn't want to be nosy. The escalation for Jane wasn't dramatic at first. Slightly sharper words, jealous checks of her phone, a hand that lingered too long on the small of her back. But the control crept in until her life was measured in permissions, who she could see, where she could go, when she could spend money. That sort of daily pruning leaves a person bewildered, rearranging their world in smaller and smaller pieces to avoid conflict. It's important here to say what Jane did next because it changed everything. Not out of heroism at first, but out of exhaustion. She made a video. The camera she used wasn't fancy, a phone propped against a lamp, the light from the screen painting the room a sickly blue. For hours she recorded him. The temper, the threats, the way he would suddenly quiet down and act apologetic, as if the violence had been a storm that had passed without leaving a dent. In the footage, there are silences that speak as loudly as words. That video was cold, incontrovertible evidence. She took it to the police. He was arrested. He was sentenced to 5 years. On paper, it looked like a terrible but clean resolution, accountability, a system that had worked. In reality, theirs was never such a tidy story. After the sentencing, her friends decided to do something small and human, throw her a party. Not a big gesture, just a living room thing with bad nachos and Christmas crackers, the kind of imperfect warmth you try to manufacture when people you love have been through too much. There was a rule pinned to the fridge, in letters that could have been a punchline in a different life. Don't mention Nick. A practical thing, mostly. Keep the mood light, keep Jane from getting pulled back into the memory loops. She wanted it that way. At the party, she smiled with friends who'd seen the trailer and the aftermath, who knew where the real cuts were, even if she kept them hidden. That night, the apartment smelled of citrus and cheap wine. There were fairy lights strung like a net across the living room, blinking in a lazy rhythm as if blinking could reset everything. Someone had put on an old Christmas playlist, Motown, creamed up with berryness at odd moments between songs. I remember the smallness of it. Only 8 of us in a room, 2 kids asleep on the couch, Jane sitting in a chair near the window that fogged from our breath. We watched her mouth form jokes she did not feel. We watched her take in the warmth like a person learning to trust the sun after a long, cold winter. Halfway through a song, Steph, one of the quieter ones in the group, with a laugh the shape of a question, pulled me aside. "She looks," she said, and couldn't finish the sentence. It was the kind of look that sits in your chest. I nodded. We said nothing. That was our plan. Be ordinary. Then, around 11, somebody's kid pointed at the window and whispered, "Is that Santa?" It was meant to be a joke. We all turned as one. Outside, in the reflected glass, a shadow moved. At first, I thought it was someone delivering a parcel, the sort of suburban figure you barely notice in winter. Then, a face at the glass, hands pressed to the cold, watching. The first voice I heard say the words aloud was Jane's. "He's outside." It should have been impossible. He was serving time. We all knew that. But when your body recognizes the presence of a threat, your brain stops wanting to be reasonable. There's a certain animal clarity to it. Jane's hands crumpled the napkin she had been holding. Her breath hitched like a thing trying to find purchase. For a few seconds that felt like a slow inversion of the world, none of us could move. She stood up as if drawn by an unseen thread. "No," she said, low, trying to steady herself. "Don't look. Don't. Just call 911. One of us fumbled for the phone. Someone else hit the porch light. People began to murmur and reach for doors and coats. The two sleeping kids stirred, eyes half open, dreaming of reindeer. A Christmas party in slow motion became something else. Theater in which the audience is suddenly the set.
It is worth pausing here to say that in domestic violence cases, the most dangerous times are often the ones you think you'll be safest in. Gatherings of friends, public places where a perpetrator might be humiliated and lash out, the thin edges of what a victim might think of as protection. We tell ourselves a different story at Christmas, that the season polices itself. That night was a reminder that no such invisible guard exists. "Who's at the door?" Nick's voice, unmistakable and like a thrown pebble. He shouldn't have been there. He was supposedly in custody, serving time in the antiseptic courtroom phrasing of reports and sentencing statements. But hearing him outside the apartment made the facts and the feeling diverge. We heard hurried footsteps on the stairs. Someone locked the deadbolt. Jane's mouth carved itself into something like a smile she didn't mean. He knocked, then rattled the doorknob. Maybe he expected a confrontation. Maybe he expected that after the sentence, men who loved to break things would slide back into family rooms like a delayed storm. Maybe he simply had not processed the consequences. None of us could say. What we did know was that he sounded different, loud, animal, fueled by entitlement. There is a panic that is not loud, that is a tightening in the throat and a dry at the base of the tongue. That was what I felt. Ryan, who had a way of standing like a man who'd been waiting for instructions he never got, picked up an old cricket bat leaning against the coat stand. Why a cricket bat? I asked later. It was one of those British imports people kept for novelty, an awkward piece of wood that read more like a prop than a weapon. In our apartment that night, it became the only thing that seemed like resistance. Ryan's hands were steady. He moved toward the door. There was yelling outside now. The voice of Nick, the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. The door rattled again. Then, a sound like a body hitting the wood. "Open up," he shouted. "It's me." There was a sick, sick syllable to it. To be called by your abuser's name in your own home is to feel the floor tilt. We did what people do in those sudden crises. Someone pulled curtains, someone blocked the children away, someone called 911, someone checked the locks twice. The phone call was made in choked, clipped words. The dispatcher asked the usual triage questions. Where are you? Is anyone injured? Is the suspect inside? It was a police drill that had never felt more urgent. We were on speaker, the voice of authority, a thin lifeline. Nick forced the door. He pushed. Someone on the other side of the door, I still don't know who, might have shoved him back, or the lock might simply have held. The apartment became a corridor of movements. The clatter of someone trying to get in, the scuff on the wood, the muffled curses. Then, the glass of the window next to the door shattered.
Something hit the floor, like a bag or an object used to break the pain. One of the kids started to cry, those baby wails that prick like a bell. And then the fight began. I'll be honest, fights change how you see time. They compress history into sharp angles. You see a bat rise, and you see all the memories that led to that moment in the lift. You see a friend's face and profile, and the future you had imagined for them, as if it's a picture you can snatch. Ryan swung the bat. It landed on Nick's shoulder, a satisfying thunk that didn't feel triumphant, but necessary. Nick reeled back, half with surprise, half with fury, and then pushed through, or tried to. People grabbed, shoved, shouted. There was the metallic scent of fear and city air coming through the broken glass. At some point, someone called his name, a personal plea. "Nick, stop!" Without the power of law behind it, the word was a tether. Steph, who had been quiet all evening, stepped between them with a kind of quiet ferocity that surprised me. "Get out," she said, not pleading now, commanding. There's a moral logic in the middle of chaos. People choose a side. That night, the house took sides. We were no longer a living room. We were a line of people with only one object in common, a collective refusal to let violence take root again. Nick stumbled through the broken window, cut by the glass, but not so badly as to stop him. He took off down the street like someone fleeing a fate he hadn't anticipated. We opened doors, trying to see him go. A neighbor appeared in the doorway, pajamas flapping, confused and sickened. Someone else dialed 911 again to say he was running down the block, direction east, wearing a black coat. The dispatcher told us officers were en route. The warmth of that promise was thin but present. The cops' sirens arrived later than any of us wanted, but sooner than we expected, blue and red cutting through the festive music as if reality were a jarring chord. 2 squad cars pulled up. Officers spilled out, flashlights slicing the darkness. They took statements, separated us, asked for names and dates and sequences and businesslike, calm tones that felt almost obscene in their orderliness. They bagged shards of glass and took photographs. They made someone, I think Jane, sit while they asked questions she had been trying to answer for months. It was then we learned a detail that lodged like a stone in my throat. The arresting officers said Nick had been out. There was some paperwork, they said, some error at the jail, a clerical mistake, a released status not noticed, stamped wrong. Those words, clerical error, have a hollow ring when your life has been counted on the wrong side. They didn't say anything yet about how long he'd been out. They didn't say anything decisive about consequences. They weren't sure, and that uncertainty landed on us like sleet. Jane went numb, the color leaving her face in a slow, theatrical way.
She sat in a kitchen chair with her hands folded in her lap. Someone covered her with a blanket. The officers asked her if she wanted to press charges now, asked if she wanted an emergency protective order. She couldn't decide. There are moments when a person is asked to choose between their dignity and their safety, and sometimes the two are not equivalent. She chose, in the end, to stay, not out of bravery in the grand sense, but because there were kids asleep in the same room, and because the alternative was to let the night swallow her whole. The immediate aftermath was chaotic in small domestic ways. We sat up for hours afterward, wrapped in the residue of fear. The playlist played more quietly. Somebody reheated a casserole and passed around mugs that steam fogged up into tiny halos. We held hands or shoulders, or we didn't. There were whispered plans about next steps: check local shelters, see if Jane wanted to stay with family, talk to a victim liaison. The cops took our statements and promised to look for him, to put out an alert. They explained in the language of bureaucracy and protocols how they would file a report and forward it to the district attorney. And then the night folded into that weird limbo only a holiday can make. We were standing in the rubble of ordinary life. There was an edge of anger in the air, and in that anger there was also something like a fierce, tender protectiveness. The party had been meant to restore a little normalcy. Instead, it became a gauntlet that confirmed what we'd been afraid of, that evil can show up at the precise hour you let her guard down. In the days that followed, the story collected small appendages, forms to fill out, contacts given, hotlines suggested. Jane signed a few papers. The police contacted the jail administration. The jail administration said they were investigating. Clerical error, someone echoed. Later, the county published a statement that an internal review was underway. Later still, officials would call it a temporary release due to processing faults, and insist that measures would be taken to prevent the recurrence. Those words are useful for public consumption. They promise action, but they do not undo the terror of a night when a woman found herself staring at a man who had once had the power to break her. There are technical things I'm summarizing because they don't make for good theater, but they matter deeply. The difference between someone being held and someone being released can be a single misfiled document, a missed check in a system whose daily work is to assume people are neutral. The system is not designed to understand the particular calculus of an abuser who will not accept a court's order as an endpoint. It assumes compliance. When compliance fails, the cracks show. I spent a lot of time after that night trying to make sense of how a system that can close a case with such certainty could also loosen its grip so easily.
The investigation into the jail's procedures dragged on in the way official things do, neatly, with deadlines that blurred, with letters that began with the words, "We regret to inform." At one point, a liaison officer told us, "These events are rare," as if that should comfort anyone. To victims, rare is small consolation when the consequences are enormous. Jane, meanwhile, changed, not in the melodramatic, cinematic way of becoming stronger, as if trauma is a seasoning you acquire. She tired more easily. She started sleeping with the lights on. There were nights she would wake and replay the sound of the glass breaking. She stopped trusting her own sense of safety in a way that made every little ordinary noise a potential threat. When friends offered to take shifts staying at her place, she accepted. She accepted with the same hesitation you accept a splint. She was relieved that we stayed, embarrassed that we stayed, grateful and furious, and complicated in ways people allow themselves to be only after the first months have worn off. Legal processes, too, are not clean. The prosecutors, when they met with Jane, walked the line between advocating for her and managing a caseload with limited resources. Evidence can be compelling and yet insufficient. Witnesses can be willing and yet unreliable, in the way memory becomes after a shock. It is not that justice refused to exist. It was that justice was a slow-moving mechanism that does not always align with the urgent rhythms of human safety. I remember a conversation I had with Jane months later, in which she said something that has stayed with me. It wasn't the breaking in that terrified me the most, she told me over coffee, stirring sugar into a mug with hands that shook a little. It was that they'd been able to just walk out of the system, that the thing that was supposed to make me safe had holes you could see through. She said it not with rhetorical flourish, but with a kind of weary precision. That sense of betrayal, by institutions, by the idea that laws and locks are safeguards, is a wound that doesn't heal with visible scars. It is a cognitive erosion. There is also, beside the failure of official systems, the strange and fragile triumph of community. Ryan, Steph, the neighbors who came to the window, they could have done nothing. They did something. Their intervention that night may well have saved Jane from worse. The blunt, messy reality of ordinary people stepping in to protect one another is a recurring theme in violent stories because it's true. When institutions lag, human networks often move faster. We don't always talk about that part because it's not dramatic in the same way as a broken lock or hospital visit, but it's vital. It sits in the margins of every report, and became for some of us a testament to the fact that civility has teeth when it needs them. Still, heroism in a living room is complicated. There are legal questions and moral ones.
Ryan could have been criminally charged for using a weapon, even if it was in defense. The police who arrived were delicate in how they treated the men at the scene. Their notes were clinical. Later, when the formalities became paperwork, the defense of a friend in a domestic situation was doable and understandable, but it entered the ledger of liability just the same. For survivors, that ambiguity adds weight to choices they must make in the heat of the moment. Weeks later, official channels did what they do. They reviewed the clerical mistake. They found causes and proposed corrective measures. Nick was apprehended again. He was taken back into custody. He appeared in court. Papers were filed. The legal story moves on in its own language. For Jane, the longer story was quieter. Therapy sessions, group meetings with others who had known the same small, hard terrors, and the slow work of rebuilding trust with herself. For me, for my role as witness and friend, the night named something I had assumed about safety and stripped it down. I used to think of holidays as places that absorbed the dark edges of life. That night I learned that those edges sometimes press harder against the light. The memory lodged in the way you remember weather, the sharp cold of the window pane under your palm, the clink of glass, the smell of cheap wine and baking soda, the broken cadence of a carol played half-hearted me through speakers. We ended the night the way people often do after something violent, with small rituals of reconnection. A hug that lasted too long, someone kneeling to calm a child with a song, someone else stepping out into the frost to smoke and breathe and wonder if the world had changed or if they had. There is a kind of sacrament in those small gestures, the shared tea, the exchanged numbers, the quiet plan to check on one another. They are what keeps people living after the world inclines toward breaking. This then is the first of the 4 stories, a house full of friends, a party meant to heal, and an interruption that showed how thin the seam between law and chaos can be. It is not, by a long shot, an isolated case. Across the country, small clerical errors, momentary lapses, an underfunded system contribute to similar night terrors for people who simply wanted Christmas to be a good night. If you're into long-form narratives like this one and want to see more, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There's more to come, and I don't want you to miss it. I mention all of that because what came after the party, the official paperwork, the court dates, the visits from victim advocates, is one side of the ledger, but the nights that followed were where the texture of trauma really lived. Jane began to keep a list of things she didn't trust anymore. Closed blinds at noon, the sound of someone tapping at the door, a knock that didn't say who it was.
She started sleeping with her phone under her pillow and the ringer set to a volume that smacked of anxiety rather than precaution. Her world compressed to her immediate horizon and the people she knew could be counted as allies. That compression is a common after effect of living through violence,
The field of possibility narrows to the predictable. And then there were the quiet things, the way she flinched every time a man raised his voice on television, the way she couldn't watch soap operas where couples argued, the way she would rehearse exits from restaurants in her head before she went out. These are not dramatic gestures, they're survival. Friends learned, gradually, how to be around her without reminding her of what had happened. They learned which jokes made her wince and which made her breathe. I don't tell you any of this to indict or to moralize. I tell it because these details are the ongoing life of any violent encounter. They are the parts that remain when the headlines go away and when the court dates stop appearing on calendars. They are the parts that make "it'll be okay" sound like a hazardous promise. There was, too, a slow public unspooling. Local news picked up the story in a way that made me uncomfortable. They ran the angle of the dramatic, a Christmas party interrupted, and glossed over the months of daily fear that had preceded it. Headlines loved the neat contrast, festive lights and a violent intrusion. They loved the shock. But the human stuff, the paperwork, the conversations with police about better checks, the small local meetings on domestic violence resources, that was harder to make into a headline. It mattered more. It changed lives in ways silence never could. One of the more painful parts of Jane's recovery was the realization that even when the law did its part, the social fallout could be cruel. People offered opinions that suggested she had overreacted or that she had invited trouble in some way. That victim blaming is an afterburn that can be as poisonous as the original act. It is not enough that someone be freed from immediate danger if their reputation and their social standing are harmed in the process. The community is supposed to hold the person harmed. Sometimes it doesn't. When I visited Jane a few months later, she was painting the living room wall, a color chosen deliberately to be non-committal, not beige, not brave. She had a copy of a legal pamphlet beside her and a stack of numbers on a post-it. She made tea and gave me the cup with hands that trembled less. "It will not define me," she said, but she said it like a rubric she was trying on. There is a strange grammar to resilience. You say the sentence and hope to inhabit it later. Near the end of that winter, there was a small private court hearing.
Details here are procedural and should be approached with the caution any legal description demands. People may remember dates differently, charges might be amended. Public records show what they show. What I can say is that Nick was taken back into custody and eventually escorted to serve out a sentence that had been interrupted. The public phrases were tidy. The lived ones were not. There are rarely clean endings in these stories. Closure is often an afterthought, and sometimes a myth. I should also say plainly that Jane, over time, found ways to live that were not defined by that one night. She moved, she joined a support group, she learned certain rituals of care that became her armor. She forgave in her own private way, not as an absolution of the wrong that had been done, but as a means of refusing to let hatred be the center of her life. This is a kind of complicated survival that people take different paths through. Some seek legal vindication, others seek solitude, some seek to rebuild ties slowly. All of them are valid. All of them are human. Still, in the arc of that winter, the party remained an emblem. An evening meant to stitch a wound only made the tear wider before it began to mend. It tells you something essential about the holidays. Not that they are inherently dangerous, but that they are emotionally charged spaces where ordinary routines can collide with extraordinary risks. The protective bubble we imagine around December can be punctured by coincidence, by error, by systems that are not as tight as we always assume. And that's why I'm starting with Jane, because she is, in a way, emblematic of how close the ordinary gets to the terrible, because her story shows the brittle seam between law and safety, the communal impulse to protect when institutions falter, and the quiet work of living after the night someone tried to take that life from you. It is a story of fury and tenderness, and small acts of bravery that don't always get the attention they deserve. There is more to say about what administrations and institutions could do to prevent those clerical cracks that let a violent person back out into the world. There are policy suggestions and data and practices that work better in some jurisdictions than others. But I will leave the policy deep dive for later. For now, I wanted you to have the texture of the evening, the human scale of the fear, and the small tender answers that friends provided. Because the next story, the one about my grandmother and a Santa Grotto, takes a very different shape. It happens decades earlier, in a different place, but it carries some of the same themes. The mismatch between expectations and reality at Christmas,
and the way ordinary people can step into the breach. Before I move on, let me be clear. If any part of what you've heard resonated or raised something painful in you, it is okay to pause. If you are in immediate danger, please call 911.
If you need to talk to someone about domestic violence or abuse, there are national hotlines and local services that can help you make a plan. People survive these things. Community, therapy, and time change the grammar of a life. But survival is not the same as being unscarred. Those scars deserve attention and care. That night, the party, the door, the bat, the way the world tilted, it stayed with all of us. It was our reminder that victimhood is not a private misfortune, but a communal one. We had been given a window into how fragile the protections around us can be, and we chose, for the most part, to do something about it. That is not a tidy ending. It is only a beginning. If you think the last story was extreme, the next one is the sort of thing people tell their grandchildren about until everyone realizes how true it was. It takes place in a grocery of a different time, with sleigh bells and a grotto that smelled faintly of oranges and machine oil. It involves my grandmother, a shotgun she kept for bad dogs, and a Santa with mismatched eyes. The way she handled it is the kind of household legend you hear in some towns, equal parts pride and disbelief. I'll tell you how it unfolded. The grotto smelled like oranges and machine oil. That's the first thing I remember when I think of my grandmother's story. The lights in the department store were softer then, and the paper garlands drooped the way someone's mood can, a little tired around the edges. It was 1961, a December that felt like the end of an era. Small-town radios playing Perry Como, a town where the post office still knew everyone's affairs, and where you could leave a loaf of bread on a neighbor's stoop without thinking twice. My grandmother, she was called Mabel by most people, but everyone else also called her Gran as if it were a title of office, did not do small talk well. She did not mince words. She had hands that smelled faintly of bacon and lemon polish, and an eye for trouble that bordered on prophecy. In her 40s then, she ran errands like a woman who had already decided the day would bend to her will. She'd been widowed younger than seemed fair, and learned, as a result, to carry both the groceries and the neighborhood's sense of propriety. That winter, she was taking my cousin to see Santa in the grotto, bringing a pot of stew as part of a volunteer rota for the homebound. There were 40 years of community knowledge folded into her stooped posture. The grotto was nothing grand. A curtained booth near the canned goods, a plywood throne, a man wearing a red suit that had seen better Christmases. That year, something felt off. The queue moved too quickly, the Santa seemed distracted, and his eyes, one dark, one light, caught the fluorescent glare in a way that made my grandmother squint. Heterochromia, the doctor and me would eventually call it, but in that moment she simply thought, wrong. There's a way people carry danger like a scuffed shoe. You can't ignore it once you notice the sound. Later that night, the radio bulletin crackled out the name of 2 wanted men, described as dangerous and possibly armed. One of them was described as having mismatched eyes. A reporter's voice ran over the song White Christmas, like a scraping finger on a record. My grandmother set down her knitting and marched to the car. There's a morality in small towns that makes people move as a single organism when a hazard passes through. It's a kind of civic instinct. She drove back to the store with her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only honest thing left. No one expected what happened next. She stepped into the dim parking lot and saw a car idling at the curb, 2 men talking in low voices. My grandmother, who had raised 3 kids and had been through the cold rationing of war and the stubbornness of grief, did not hesitate. She loaded a .45 she kept for bad dogs, as she described it to anyone who asked, and approached the idling car like a person walking into a conversation she would not tolerate. The men noticed her coming, and there was a pause as if the world had been asked to hold its breath. She told the story later in the way people tell stories they have turned into legend, with a little embellishment, a little humility, and the conviction that she had acted as any decent person would. She walked up to the window, put the gun on the hood of the car, public, startling, and told them to get out. The men laughed at first, mildly contemptuous. Then they recognized who she was, or perhaps they recognized the certainty in her voice, and laughed less. She held them at gunpoint until deputies arrived, and by the time the blue lights painted the asphalt, the men were in handcuffs. The newspapers called her brave. The town council declared a day of thanks. Later they gave her a parade which she attended reluctantly, waving like someone who'd rather have stayed home with her stew. The officers who had arrested the men told it differently according to procedure. They recited times and statements and the policy about civilians intervening. There were debates then about whether an untrained person should confront suspects. It was, said the armchair critics, risky and potentially illegal. People argued about what was sensible and what was reckless. Gran's answer was always a single, dry line. Someone had to stop them.
There are layers to that episode that matter when you squint at it through the lens of the present. First, the wartime sensibility that armed ordinary citizens in rural towns used as a form of neighborhood policing. Second, the limitations of local law enforcement in the early 1960s, fewer resources, slower radio communication, and a reliance on civic intervention in emergencies. My grandmother's decisive action filled a gap in a system that, in that moment, lacked the speed of modern response.
The corollary is awkward. Justice felt immediate because a citizen made it so, and that immediacy cut both ways. When people pick up weapons, even in defense, the moral calculus complicates. There is also a tenderness to the story. After the arrests, my grandmother sat on the stoop with the pot of stew beside her and wept a little, not because of the danger, but because she had seen what might have happened to children. People thanked her, and she shrugged it off with a look that suggested the thanks were embarrassing and unnecessary at once. In the quiet years that followed, the town told the story each December like a talisman. It became a thing parents used to make a point about watching out for one another. It became, in short, a story that insisted on both courage and a particular kind of civic responsibility. But I want to be honest about the moral friction here. If civic heroics are romanticized too often, they can mask the structural failures that made them necessary. Why were there two men in a grocery lot, unknown and threatening? Why did the local sheriff's office have only one car on patrol that night? Why do small towns rely on parish balance sheets for safety? The answers are messy. Budgets, politics, priorities. The upshot is that ordinary people sometimes must slip into roles that should belong to institutions, and that slips us into a kind of vigilantism that has both light and shadow. My grandmother's story is, for all its warmth, a reminder that systems that fail require someone to patch the hole quickly, and sometimes that patch is a person carrying a gun. The grotto episode sits beside the Jane story in the way of counterpoints. In Jane's case, institutions failed by releasing someone who should have remained detained. In my grandmother's, institutions were slow and under-resourced, but community muscle, in the form of a single brave woman, created a stopgap that kept a disaster at bay. Both stories, however, underscore the same truth. The season's prettiness is a veneer that can come off to reveal either an absence or an extraordinary presence of protection. And if you think this country tale is quaint and safely distant from modern harm, wait. The next memory I'll share is mine, and it sits in a different register, a child's foggy belief in Santa colliding with something filthy and real. It's about how adults choose to protect children, sometimes by lying softly, and how the truth finds its way back years later with the bluntness of a courtroom knock. I was 7 when I saw him on the fire escape. It was a tenement with Christmas lights in the windows and laundry lines like banners. Outside, in that sloped, close-knit street, winter had an honesty that snow can't hide, the kinds of sounds that sit in the bones. It was late. My parents were asleep. The sight I remember is absurdly ordinary. A man on the fire escape, in a red suit that had the sad drape of someone who'd put it on as a job, not a joy.
He had a large bag and a hat slightly askew. For a child, anything that answers the mental image of Santa is a miracle. I pressed my face to the window and watched him climb down, saw the flash of material that might have been fur trimmed with real fur or some cheaper imitation. I ran to wake my parents, because that was the script I'd been taught. Some things were sacred enough to be woken. They came in, sleepy and amused, and told me to wait. Then in the morning there were presents under the tree, the sort that seemed to come directly from the cosmos. I went through the rituals of delight like a dutiful believer, and afterward we all went on with the day. The man on the fire escape became a secret emblem of Christmas magic in our house, a detail parents used as proof of the season's small miracles. Months later, after the Christmas lights had been packed away and the neighborhood had settled into the ordinary strains of January, a police knock came. Officers on the stoop, shoes sinking in the unshoveled walk, asked questions that didn't belong to our childish map. Had we seen anyone leaving the building that night? Had we been awake? The room that had been full of laughter then became small and bright in a different way. Later, the truth came out in a series of grim facts, delivered with professional distance. A murder had occurred upstairs, brutal and senseless. The man on the fire escape, covered in blood, had run in the direction of our building. He was alone, apparently, bereft of the pretense of joy he'd worn an hour before. The officers explained in clipped phrases. He had been involved in a violent confrontation in an apartment above. A man had died, stabbed many times, the word many said with an attempt at detachment that didn't work, and the Santa escaped down the alley.
They knocked doors, took statements, and typed out notes. For me, a child, the narrative was elastic. I attached horror to a symbol of warmth, and then spent years trying to reconcile the two images. The man who had become my brief hero, red suit, bag over his shoulder, turned out to be part of a piece of violence that had no place near my ritual of gifts and songs. Years later, when I was old enough to ask smarter questions, I asked my mother why she had let me keep that comforting picture. "We wanted you to believe," she said simply, sitting at the kitchen table with a cigarette dimly smoldering. She wasn't being cynical. She was choosing to fold danger away so a child's nights could be full of simple certainties. It's a kind of parental sovereignty, and it's not evil. It's tactical. You shield what you can so small people can sleep without nightmares. But there it remained, the knowledge that under the tinsel there can be hands that have done awful things. That kind of knowledge reframes the way you trust the world. It doesn't strip you of wonder entirely, but it teaches you that magic and danger often share a postcode.
That collision between a child's view of the world and adult reality is more common than we like to admit. Parents tell stories in the language of sheltering. We smooth the edges so the rawness of life doesn't tear open a child's tender places. Sometimes those stories work. Sometimes they are all we have. The memory of that Santa stayed with me because it reframed my sense of what adults were willing to carry so a child could believe. It wasn't an indictment so much as an observation. We do what we can with the resources at hand, whether those resources are stew on a stoop or a story about a red-suited stranger with a sack of toys. Between that memory and the next story, a scene in Marseille that is likely the most wrenching of the four, there is a strange thematic bridge, the way communities attempt to heal grief and the way grief can be weaponized. My grandmother fed the hungry. My mother hid a truth to protect me. Neighbors in a French port city tried to console a bereaved mother and found instead an obscene mockery. The next narrative is a long and heavy one. Before I tell it, I want to pause and include a content note because it's the one that carried the most sustained emotional violence of the stories I've collected. Content note. The following segment includes descriptions of gang intimidation, a human remains-related threat, and sustained psychological terror. If those topics are likely to be triggering, please take care or skip ahead. Marseille in the late 1970s was a city under pressure, a Mediterranean port whose docks carried not only oranges and soap, but shadows. It was a place where neighborhoods were stitched together by families and by fear alike. My mother lived on a block where men crowded the cafes and women hung laundry like flags. The city had a history of informal power structures, local bosses, petty tyrants, who ran protection schemes and territorial disputes that bubbled into violence more often than anyone wanted to count. My mother was at ground level of all that, a woman trying to raise children, keep a home, and make sense of a world where you learned early which windows to keep bolted. Madame Basaka, she lived 3 doors down and had a son who, in the stories people told, had drifted towards the wrong crowd. He was said to have been enticed into dealing and then into something darker. By the time Christmas came, he had vanished. Families in those neighborhoods learned to fold grief into their daily routines quietly. A mother's stooped walk, a neighbor bringing stew, a bag left anonymously at the door. On one Christmas Eve, the block decided in a small and human way to raise money and deliver a present to Madame Basaka. They wanted to show solidarity. They wanted to remind a grieving mother that she was not alone when the city around them was crowded with people who sometimes pretended not to notice misfortune.
Neighbors gathered, pooled coins, and bought a gift that could not replace a lost child, but might soften the day. In the dim light, on the morning of December 25th, a box wrapped in cheap paper sat at the foot of her stoop. She opened it with the trembling, mechanical motions of someone who has rehearsed grief 1,000 times. Inside lay, horribly, grotesquely, a human skull, wrapped in tissue like an obscene ornament. On top of the skull was a note, a short taunt, something that implied the corpse belonged to a son she had lost, that suggested her pain was not private, but a theatrical toy to be paraded. The intended message was clear. We can reach you. We can humiliate you. Your grief belongs to us to manipulate. The presence of the skull was not merely intimidation. It was an act calibrated to dissolve dignity and to twist mourning into public humiliation. Police were called, of course. Their report was clinical. They took photographs, sealed the box,
and sent samples to specialists. For reasons never fully explained to neighbors, there were no usable fingerprints on the wrapping. The act bore all the hallmarks of a gang message meant to scare a neighborhood into silence. People who had lived through artillery and occupation said it smelled of the old, practiced violence that understood how to humiliate as effectively as it could kill. I remember the way my mother came home that day, pale, the kind of pallor that accompanies foreign smoke. She told us, in fragments, that the skull had been old, the teeth worn, and that the coroner's office suspected it belonged to a person from another era, or at least had been curated for its shock value. It wasn't the immediate identification that mattered, it was the message. Madame Basaka had been reduced to a symbol for others to manipulate. For broader context, Marseille's organized crime history includes episodes where bodies or body parts were used as visual threats to demonstrate power. This is a language gangs sometimes use, a grotesque punctuation to underline invulnerability. The investigators moved slowly, cited jurisdictional difficulties, and warned residents to be cautious. Community meetings were held in the church basement, where neighbors shared coffee and outrage, and the small comforts of mutual anger. People decided to take turns bringing food and checking in on Madame Basaka, because fear had become contagious. My mother and others started making plans to emigrate. Safety, they agreed, required a literal relocation. It is difficult to convey the way a skull in a box can do more than terrify. It can reshape life plans, push people into exile, force choices about what kind of grieving is allowed. Some people leave, others stay and live under the humiliation like a second skin. For Madame Basaka, the immediate aftermath involved both police procedure and neighborly solace.
Detectives interviewed anyone who might have known something. A liaison officer noted in his report that the skull could have been planted by a rival faction seeking to destabilize a territory. There were no arrests that fit the crime neatly. Suspicion hovered, but not the decisive moment that arrests provide. The community, though shaken, coalesced in small ways. Women took care of her house. Men mended fences as if to repair the very fabric of safety. Eventually, my mother made the decision to leave for Canada with our family. It was a move that cost money and memory and a piece of identity, but it was also a decision to get distance from a place where the symbolic brutality could become daily. Years later, when I asked my mother about that time, she said one thing that framed the moment. It wasn't only terror, it was a show of power designed to make people feel small. That phrasing, a show of power, is exactly what it felt like. The skull wasn't necessarily proof of a body discovered. It was a prop in a public performance meant to signal who could be defied and who must be cowed. There are sociologists who talk about how criminal organizations use spectacle as control, and this was spectacle turned weapon. For the neighborhood, the skull's arrival rewired the senses. People who had once felt themselves to be in the center of a communal life, who had known who to rely on for childcare and gossip and casseroles, began to feel peripheral to a drama orchestrated by forces beyond their social capital. It pushed the question of what security means when the state is unevenly present. The police did what they could. The courts, if they were involved, were slow. In the vacuum, people made choices to leave, to hide, or to assert themselves in risky ways. The narrative element that is stark about the skull story is its symbolic brutality. A season that trades in symbols, wrapped gifts, evergreen trees, lights, was given back a horror done in the currency of symbol, a human skull as a present. It flipped the language of consolation into weaponry. It's not simply that violence happened at Christmas, it's that the culture of gift-giving itself was perverted into a method of psychological subjugation. That inversion is why it sits, for me, as perhaps the most disturbing image among these four stories. There are procedural add-ons worth noting for viewers who like the arc of administrative response. Forensics examined the skull. It was cataloged and tested. They found no fingerprints. The packaging was intentionally handled to avoid trace evidence. Detectives reached a dead end. The investigation produced a stack of polite, formal letters, and then, mostly, a quiet. No one was arrested in time to give neighbors the closure they wanted. Madame Basaka eventually emigrated. People who stayed behind learned to keep extra lights on and to avoid gatherings that used to be routine. The skull's psychological effect rippled longer than any single police shift. There is a cultural angle too. Marseille's urban economy and the social demography of the time created zones where state presence was inconsistent. Communities formed their own safety networks, a short-term patchwork of care. Yet those networks could be vulnerable to predation by actors with different goals. The skull, as it circulated through local memory, became a symbol of the fact that sometimes, in marginal spaces, humiliation can be a tactic as effective as bullets. It's a hard lesson. Terror can be bureaucratic, theatrical, and efficient. When I look back on the 4 stories together, there's a thread that connects them beyond their seasonal setting. Each one shows a different way that the ordinary assumptions of Christmas get overturned. Jane's party reveals the fragility of institutional safety and the force of friends. My grandmother's grotto episode shows the ways civic courage can make a difference when systems are thin. The Santa on the fire escape memory illustrates how adults negotiate truth to spare children. And Madame Basaka's skull shows how symbols of comfort can be inverted into instruments of power. I want to offer a longer reflection, not as a lecture, but as an attempt to synthesize what these episodes mean when you look at them together. Christmas is, culturally, an amplified time. Expectations swell and institutions perform. Courts close early, nightlife thins, welfare services sometimes operate on reduced schedules, and people gather in patterns that are predictable and therefore vulnerable. The season's ritual emphasis on family, on home, on generosity creates both spaces of safety and, paradoxically, concentrated opportunities for harm. From a systemic perspective, holidays produce a peculiar stress on public services. Police staffing patterns change, emergency rooms are busier in some ways and quieter in others. Social services can be stretched thin. That logistical reality, the calendar's pressure, has consequences for people who live with chronic insecurity. In other words, danger doesn't time itself to avoid Christmas. It simply inhabits the gaps that the holiday creates. Clerical errors don't respect calendars, neither do gangs or abusers. There is also a cultural myth that deserves attention, the idea that holidays cleanse social relations. We tell ourselves peace on earth to comfort all manner of social omissions. This myth is powerful because it is desirable, and desire becomes a collective narrative. But when desire collides with the real arrangements of life, poverty, addiction, territorial crime, the myth collapses into disappointment, or, as in these stories, into outright harm. The contrast between ornament and assault is not merely dramatic, it's a real-world problem of how societies imagine their moral shape versus the material mechanisms that keep people safe. Perhaps the most important commonality in these stories is the role of community. When institutions falter, whether through clerical error, resource limits, or corruption, neighbors, friends, and family often become the first and most effective line of defense. That is both beautiful and alarming. Beautiful because it reaffirms the human capacity for solidarity. Alarming because informal networks can be inconsistent, uneven, and sometimes themselves implicated in the dynamics of harm. Heroic acts, like my grandmother's, can save lives. Collective intervention, like the friends who defended Jane, can avert escalation. Yet we should not treat community heroics as an adequate substitute for reliable institutions. The ideal is both: well-functioning institutions that reduce the need for ad hoc interventions, and strong community bonds that provide care when institutions lag. This leads to practical reflections without being prescriptive. If you or someone you know is living with a threat, small steps matter. Safety planning, keeping a bag ready, sharing your location with trusted people, informing local advocates can make a difference. Neighbors watching out for one another, checking in, and refusing to normalize intimidation can also shift the cost-benefit calculations of would-be perpetrators. These are not cures. They are partial, human responses to structural problems. They work better when supported by robust social services and accountable law enforcement. I also want to name the psychological terrain of survivors in a way that centers dignity. People who live through violent episodes have complicated relationships to resilience. They may be brave and fragile in the same breath. They may want to be quiet about their trauma and simultaneously demand justice. They may forgive, withdraw, rage, or all of the above at different times. None of these choices are fixed moral truths. They are human responses. Our role as a community is to offer resources, to listen, and to avoid the quick judgments that so often compound harm. Before I end, a practical note. If anything I've said here resonates unpleasantly, for instance, a memory it reactivates, please consider reaching out to a local helpline or crisis service. If you are in immediate danger, call 911. If the pain is not immediate but heavy, a therapist, counselor, or support group can be a lifeline. The presence of a listener who understands trauma's complexities matters. It reduces the isolation which often compounds suffering. Reaching out is not a sign of ongoing weakness.
It's an act of dignity. These 4 stories are not allegories. They are not designed to moralize in a single sweep. They are rather snapshots, close-up portraits of what can happen when the world's ordinary rituals meet human malice or error. They are reminders, too, of the ways community and human decency show up, awkward and imperfect, to try to hold people together. Christmas does not have to be dangerous. For most people, it is not.
But the stories I shared show why it's wise to not romanticize safety, and why it's important to respect those who bear scars from what was meant to be a time of joy. They remind us that holidays can amplify everything, good and bad, because they are moments when we are more visible to each other, and therefore more vulnerable. If these stories moved you, if they made you think of someone who needs to hear them, please consider sharing this video with that person. And if you want to support more deep dives like this, links and ways to submit your own story are in the description. I read what people send. I am always humbled by the trust involved in sharing such intimate things. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other. And if tonight is one of those nights that brings back a weight, remember, you don't have to carry it alone.